Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. Our guest today is Kevin Rudd. He's a former Prime Minister of Australia and he's currently the President and CEO of the Asia Society. He joins us from Brisbane in Australia. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much for being with us here today on France 24.
It's good to be with you.
Mr. Rudd, since Australia decided last week to ditch a massive submarine contract with France in favor of a similar deal with the US and the UK, Paris is furious. It is denouncing a betrayal, a stab in the back by close allies, even recalling its ambassadors both to Washington and to Canberra in an unprecedented move. So my first question, is this merely a French temper tantrum, or is the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison right? This is what's needed to protect Australia's national security interest.
Well, my argument is pretty simple. Number one is if the Australian government had concluded that the technical requirements for this submarine project had changed, and for both technical and strategic reasons we needed to move from conventional submarines to nuclear-powered submarines, then the Australian government should have done two or three things. One, notify the government of France. Two, notify the French contractor, Naval. And three, if new specifications were to be released for nuclear-powered boats, then the UK, France, and the United States should have been invited to tender afresh. My disagreement is therefore with the way in which this Australian government has handled this. And if the French are angry at how they've been treated, my argument is that they have every right to be angry.
Right, because basically what we've seen is a kind of back and forth. The Australian Prime Minister saying, we told the French many, many times, we warned them that it was getting too costly, there were too many delays, and the French are saying this is absolutely not true. A French army spokesperson said that on the very day of the announcement of the deal with the US and the UK, the Australian had given notice that things were continuing and that we could go ahead. So they're saying Australia lied to France in a very, very critical way.
Well, obviously, as a former Prime Minister, I'm not privy to the commercial discussions between the French company and the Australian Submarine Corporation in Adelaide, nor am I privy to the conversations between the Australian military and the French military. What I simply know is this: France, from my perspective, and the perspective of other former Prime Ministers of Australia, both Conservative and from the Australian Labor Party, is that we regard France as a trusted ally, partner and friend. Beyond that, we have a contract with France. And therefore, if there was a problem with the contract, if there was a problem with cost blowout, if there was a problem with the technical specifications of the boat, then the bottom line is the Australian government should have been absolutely frank with our French friends that the specifications needed to change. We were going to move to a nuclear-powered vessel, and therefore France should have been invited to tender afresh for a new type of vessel, as opposed to simply handing this project to unknown, unspecified contractors in either the United Kingdom or the United States or both. That's what I disagree with.
Right. How serious are the consequences of this? There are rumors that a free trade deal between the EU and Australia could be delayed. I mean, you negotiated a strategic partnership with France. I mean, is this just a crisis that will essentially pass, or do you think this is much more serious for Australia?
You see, the Australia-France relationship goes back a long time. Remember, we have some 50,000 of our own sons buried in French soil who fought in the defence of France and Belgium in the First World War. But we go back a long way together. Similarly, in the Second World War, where we fought closely with the Free French forces in the Pacific and in Europe and in the Middle East. But the bottom line is this: this is a very significant setback in the bilateral relationship. Macron, for example, has described this particular submarine contract as a linchpin in France's Indo-Pacific strategy. What the United States has been trying to do is to form a general strategy around the Indo-Pacific to bring together as many European and Asian partners as possible to meet the long-term challenge represented by China's rise. It would strike me, therefore, against that logic that this has been an adverse development, to say the least. Bilaterally with France and Australia, I think this will take a long time to repair. And for those of us who have invested in this relationship, myself and former Prime Minister Turnbull and others, this is 10 years of hard work in building a relationship, only to see the current Australian government tear it down.
Right, but the reason they're tearing it down is because China is flexing its muscles. Everyone agrees in the region and beyond, even here in France, that the dynamics have changed. So why not say China is much more dangerous than we thought? So this is why we're doing this. It's not against France, it's about China.
When we first framed the requirement to build a new submarine fleet about a decade ago, I was the Prime Minister. We produced a defence white paper back in 2009, which said that we needed a new fleet of 12 conventionally powered submarines. Why? Because we were dealing with the rise of China. To argue that this is a new phenomenon and alien to Australian strategic thinking a decade ago, when we framed our original request for 12 conventionally powered submarines, is patently deceptive. China has long been part of the Australian strategic calculus. My argument is, if, however, technical reasons have arisen, either with the current conventional project and cost blowout, or a strategic rationale in terms of the ability to detect submarines, which were conventionally powered rather than nuclear powered, that we had to change radically the contract and as a consequence go for nuclear powered vessels, then we should have notified the French properly. We should have then recommissioned a tender for a new replacement nuclear powered submarine project. And thirdly, there are only 3 countries that can build these things: France, the UK and the United States. And therefore it should have been a competitive tender for them. That's why I'm critical of the way in which the Australian government has handled, I think, the French with cavalier disregard.
Right. There's also a national security issue, is that if this project is implemented with the US and the UK, this essentially means the submarines would only be operational in many, many years. And we're talking about China's threat now. Is this actually, in a way, not a good strategy to protect Australia in the immediate future?
Well, I've already written in the Australian media that the problem with this decision is it leaves Australia strategically naked during much of the 2030s. My government commissioned a project to extend the life of our existing conventional submarines through until about 2032. The new fleet of submarines, which the French were building until recently, was to come into operation during the 2030s. However, if we look at now the construction program for these nuclear submarines, it's very difficult to see that these new boats would be, frankly, serviceable and usable by the Australian Navy until much later in the 2030s. And there's a further complication. Australia is not a civil nuclear power. We have all the technology. We could do it tomorrow if we liked. But there's never been a domestic consensus in Australia to build a civil nuclear industry. And if you're going to have nuclear-powered vessels, then one of the arguments which the current Australian government has never answered effectively is, how are you going to service the nuclear-powered dimension of these submarines if you don't have your own local civil nuclear capacity? That means you're therefore going to consign the maintenance of these boats to the United States. And I don't think that is fundamental with the sovereignty which we should have over our own national defence forces.
Right. There's also the issue of money. I mean, money has already been spent. The French are probably going to ask for some compensation. Are you calling for, the Parliament to look into this issue, how this was done, how much this will cost the Australian taxpayer?
I'm absolutely confident that in the Australian Parliament there will be a call for, and probably the initiation of, at a minimum, a full Senate inquiry into how this debacle, what I would describe as a foreign policy and national security debacle on the part of the Australian government's handling of the submarine project, how it happened in the first place. The reporting is that already up to 4 billion Australian dollars has been spent on this project. That leaves to one side whatever damages France may now seek from Australia as a consequence of the breaking of this project. And so therefore, the Australian public, I think, will not be happy with the waste of money, the fact that a friend, which we have had in France, has been treated badly, or, frankly, making a bid for a future where we do not know which Anglo-American vessel would be the replacement or how much it will cost. These are the reasons why the parliamentary process in Australia will, I believe, produce an inquiry. It may go further than that, in what we call in this country a full royal commission.
Kevin Rudd, I want to thank you very much for being with us here on France 24 from Brisbane, Australia. And thank you for watching this edition of The Interview. Stay tuned for more news.